Rome, a city that rose from humble beginnings along the Tiber River to command an empire stretching across 3 continents, a civilization that reshaped the world with its innovations in government, warfare, architecture, and culture, a power so vast that even in its fall, its influence never truly disappeared. In this journey through history, we will witness Rome's greatest triumphs, its darkest struggles, and the forces that led to its legendary rise and inevitable fall. This video was created, written, and edited by me because, well, who else is going to do it? And of course, it wouldn't be a YouTube video if I didn't remind you to like, comment with any topics you'd like me to cover, and subscribe for more deep dives into history. But most importantly, sit back, relax, and enjoy the story of Rome. Long before the mighty Roman Empire stretched across continents, before legions marched and emperors ruled, there was only a story, one of myth, survival, and destiny. The origins of Rome are steeped in legend, whispered through the ages as a tale of 2 brothers, a she-wolf and the founding of a city that would one day shape the world. According to Roman tradition, the story begins with the fall of Alba Longa, an ancient kingdom in central Italy. The rightful king, Numitor, was overthrown by his own brother, Amulius, who seized the throne and sought to ensure his rule by eliminating potential heirs. Numitor's daughter, Rhea Silvia, was forced to become a Vestal virgin, sworn to a life of celibacy. But the gods had other plans. It is said that Mars, the god of war, fathered twin sons with Rhea Silvia, Romulus and Remus. Seeing them as threats, Amulius ordered the infants to be cast into the Tiber River, left to perish. Yet fate intervened. The waters carried them safely to the riverbank, where they were discovered by a she-wolf who nurtured them as her own. Later, a shepherd named Faustulus found the twins and raised them, unaware of the destiny they would one day fulfill. As the twins grew, they became natural leaders, known for their strength and defiance. When they learned of their true heritage, they overthrew Amulius and restored their grandfather Numitor to the throne. But their ambition did not stop there. They sought to build their own city along the banks of the Tiber, near the very spot where the she-wolf had saved them. Yet even legends are not without conflict. Disagreements arose over where to establish their new home. Romulus preferred the Palatine Hill, while Remus favored the Aventine. According to tradition, they sought the gods' approval through augury, an ancient practice of interpreting omens from birds. Romulus claimed victory and began building the city's foundations, but tensions remained, and in a tragic turn, Romulus killed his brother Remus after an insult or act of defiance. And so, on April 21st, 753 BCE, Rome was born, founded in blood, ambition, and divine favor. While the legend of Romulus and Remus is a cornerstone of Roman identity, history tells a more complex story. Archaeological evidence suggests that settlements existed on the Palatine Hill as early as the 10th century BCE. These early inhabitants, known as the Latins, were a collection of small tribal groups who farmed, traded, and defended their lands from neighboring peoples. Rome's strategic location played a vital role in its rise. Situated on the Tiber River, it provided access to trade routes while its position among the 7 hills offered natural protection. Over time, Rome absorbed influences from its neighbors, particularly the Etruscans to the north and the Sabines, shaping its early government, religion, and military structure. What began as myth soon gave way to history. From its humble beginnings, Rome would grow into a powerful city-state, setting the stage for centuries of expansion, conquest, and cultural transformation. But before the empire, before the legions, and before the Caesars, there was simply a city built upon hills, rising from the whispers of legend into the annals of history. The Rome of these early days was little more than a cluster of huts, a collection of ambitious but disparate peoples searching for unity. It was a fragile city, carved out of the wilderness, where survival meant strength, cunning, and alliances. It would not remain a humble settlement for long. The village of Rome would grow into a kingdom led by rulers whose legacies, both real and mythic, would set the foundations for what was to come. But Rome's kings were more than just leaders. They were warriors, lawmakers, and high priests. They shaped its government, commanded its armies, and ensured the favor of the gods. Their reigns defined the customs, beliefs, and structures that would guide Rome for centuries. Yet even as they built temples and forged armies, the seeds of dissatisfaction were being sown. Unlike the great empires that would one day follow, Rome's first rulers governed in a world of small city-states where power was fragile and constantly tested. A Roman king held absolute authority, commanding both the military and religious spheres. He alone could declare war, oversee the courts, and conduct sacred rites. Yet, even in these early years, his power was not unchecked. A council of nobles, known as the Senate, had begun to take shape. Though the king ruled, the Senate advised. These men, drawn from Rome's most powerful families, did not yet hold the authority they would later wield, but their voices carried weight. They ensured that Rome's rulers could not act alone, a principle that would become deeply embedded in Roman politics. The stories of Rome's early rulers are a blend of history and legend. Each left their mark, shaping the city's identity, expanding its reach and transforming it from a loose gathering of settlers into a structured, formidable kingdom. Romulus, the city's founder, ruled first, organizing the people into tribes, setting the first laws, and through war and diplomacy ensuring Rome's survival. His legacy, however, was not without controversy. Seeking to expand the city's population, he and his men seized women from the neighboring Sabines in an act that would spark war, but ultimately lead to an alliance, intertwining the two peoples into a single Roman identity. After Romulus, the warrior's sword was set aside for the wisdom of Numa Pompilius, a ruler of peace. He established Rome's first religious institutions, organizing its priesthood and setting the rituals that would shape Roman faith for centuries. It was he who founded the Order of the Vestal Virgins, the guardians of Rome's sacred flame, and built the Temple of Janus, whose open or closed doors would signal war or peace. With Tullus Hostilius, war returned. He expanded Rome's territory through conquest, most notably in his destruction of Alba Longa, Rome's ancient Latin rival. The city was razed, its people absorbed into Rome, strengthening the growing kingdom. Ancus Marcius balanced war with progress, constructing Rome's first bridge across the Tiber and securing control over Ostia, the settlement that would one day serve as Rome's great port. It was under his rule that Rome took its first steps toward maritime power. Then came the Etruscans. Tarquinius Priscus, the first of Rome's kings from the northern Etruscan civilization, introduced new grandeur to Rome. Under his reign, great projects began, the first stone temples, paved roads, and the Circus Maximus, where thousands would one day gather for chariot races. His successors would continue to reshape Rome in the Etruscan image. Servius Tullius, a ruler of uncertain origins, revolutionized Rome's military and society. He introduced the census, organizing Rome's people into classes based on wealth, determining who would serve in the army and who would lead in battle. The rigid hierarchy of Roman society, patricians, plebeians, and the underclasses, began to take form. Yet it was Tarquinius Superbus, Tarquin the Proud, who would bring the kingdom to its end. His rule was marked by fear and oppression. He dismissed the Senate, ruled without counsel, and turned Rome into a city that served his will alone. His downfall came not through war, but through scandal. His son, the arrogant and ruthless Sextus Tarquinius, committed a crime that shook Rome to its core. Lucretia, a noblewoman of great virtue, was violated by the king's son. She would not live under such dishonor. Calling her family to her side, she told them what had happened, and then, with the eyes of Rome's nobility upon her, she took her own life. Her death was the spark that ignited the revolt. Led by Lucius Junius Brutus, the people rose against their king. No longer would Rome suffer tyranny. The city's gates were closed to the Tarquins, and they were cast out forever. Rome had been ruled by kings for nearly 2.5 centuries. Now it would be ruled by its people. The Etruscans had left a deep mark upon Rome. From them, the Romans took the practice of augury, reading the will of the gods through the flight of birds. They borrowed the grand designs of Etruscan architecture, the use of arches, great stone foundations, and the art of draining marshlands to expand their cities. Even Rome's mighty gladiatorial games had Etruscan roots, originating as funeral rites of the north. But the Etruscans also brought the cruelty of kingship, a rule of elite dominance that would not be tolerated. The overthrow of Tarquin the Proud was not just a rejection of one man. It was a rejection of the Etruscan way of rule. Rome would no longer be a kingdom under the rule of one, but a republic, where power belonged to many. With the monarchy overthrown, Rome stood at a crossroads. No longer would a single man hold unchecked power. No king would ever again sit on Rome's throne. Instead, a new system would rise, one where power would be shared, debated, and challenged. But even as Rome cast out its kings, its future remained uncertain. Wars would come, rivals would rise, and within Rome itself, struggles for power would shape the city's destiny. The foundations had been laid, but the story of Rome was only beginning. Rome had cast out its kings, but what would replace them? The city stood at a crossroads, its people determined never again to suffer the tyranny of a single ruler. Yet order had to be maintained. Rome's survival depended on structure, law, and the ability to defend itself from enemies both within and beyond its walls. The solution would be a system unlike anything seen before, a republic where power was divided, debated, and, most importantly, restrained. This was no simple transition. The foundations of the republic were built on both ideals and necessity, shaped by conflict and compromise. Its earliest leaders, determined to keep power from ever resting in the hands of one man, created a system of government that would stand for centuries, one that, though flawed and often challenged, would define Rome's future. In place of a king, Rome would be ruled by 2 consuls elected annually. These men, drawn from the aristocracy, shared power equally each with the ability to veto the other's decisions. This was the first safeguard against tyranny. No ruler could act unchecked. The Senate, once an advisory council to the kings, now held a greater role, guiding policy and ensuring continuity between leaders. Yet power in the early republic remained in the hands of the elite. The patricians, Rome's noble families, controlled the government, the military, and the economy. The common people, the plebeians, had little say in Rome's affairs. This imbalance would not go unchallenged, and the struggle between these two classes would shape much of the Republic's early history. The plebeians were the lifeblood of Rome, the farmers, artisans, and soldiers who built the city and fought its wars. Yet they had no political power. They could not hold office, propose laws, or even marry into patrician families. This injustice led to a period of great internal conflict known as the Struggle of the Orders. In an act of unprecedented defiance, the plebeians withdrew from the city in what would become known as the First Secession of the Plebs. Without them, Rome could not function. Its economy ground to a halt, its defenses weakened. The patricians, recognizing the need for compromise, granted the plebeians the right to elect their own representatives, the tribunes of the plebs, who had the power to veto any law or decision that threatened their interests. Over time, the plebeians won more rights, including the creation of the 12 Tables, Rome's first written legal code. These laws, etched into bronze tablets and displayed in the Forum, ensured that justice was no longer subject to the whims of the ruling class. This was a crucial step toward equality, though true balance between the classes remained distant. Even in its infancy, the Republic found itself constantly at war. The neighboring Latin cities, the powerful Etruscans, and the fierce Samnite tribes all saw opportunity in Rome's transition. But the city would not fall so easily. Rome's military was built upon the concept of the citizen soldier. Every land-owning male was required to serve, fighting not as a profession, but as a duty to the Republic. The Roman legion was still in its early stages, but discipline, training, and organization set it apart from the loosely assembled militias of its enemies. The Republic's greatest advantage, however, was its ability to adapt. Unlike the rigid Greek phalanx, Rome's formations evolved, allowing for greater flexibility in battle. Leadership was earned through experience, and victories were not just celebrated but studied. Mistakes were lessons, and Rome rarely repeated them. Rome's first challenge came from its Latin neighbors. Once allies, these cities now saw Rome as a threat. The Latin Wars, a series of conflicts spanning decades, tested the Republic's resilience. Yet Rome's approach to conquest was unique. Defeated enemies were not always destroyed, but absorbed. Some were granted partial citizenship, others full rights. This system, known as Romanization, ensured loyalty and helped Rome expand without constant rebellion. By the early 3rd century BCE, Rome had defeated the Etruscans, Latin rivals, and the powerful Samnites. The Greek colonies in southern Italy, once defended by the mighty general Pyrrhus of Epirus, fell as well. Pyrrhus had won costly victories against Rome, but in the end, his losses were unsustainable, a lesson that would echo through history. Rome now controlled the Italian peninsula, its power unmatched. Beyond politics and war, the Republic shaped Roman identity. Society was built upon family, duty, and the gods. The paterfamilias, or head of the household, held absolute authority over his family. Women, though legally subordinate, played crucial roles in maintaining the home and influencing their husbands and sons. Religion was woven into every aspect of life. The gods were ever present: Jupiter, the father of the heavens; Mars, the god of war; Vesta, whose sacred flame symbolized Rome's eternal spirit. Every battle, law, and decision was made with the gods in mind, their will interpreted by priests and augurs. Roman virtues, discipline, loyalty, and perseverance were not just ideals but expectations. To be Roman was to endure, to fight for the Republic, and to put the needs of the state above personal ambition. It was this mindset that allowed Rome to rise even against overwhelming odds. Rome had done what few thought possible. It had united Italy under its rule. But with victory came new challenges. Wealth poured into the Republic, changing the nature of its economy and politics. Ambitious leaders saw opportunities for personal power, and beyond Italy, greater foes loomed. The Mediterranean was not Rome's alone. To the west, across the sea, lay Carthage, a naval empire of immense wealth and influence. To the east, the remnants of Alexander the Great's world still held formidable armies. The Republic had survived its birth, but now it stood at the threshold of something far greater. By the beginning of the 3rd century BCE, Rome had established itself as the dominant force in Italy. Yet across the sea, another great power loomed: Carthage. This North African city, founded by the Phoenicians centuries earlier, had become the wealthiest and most formidable naval empire in the western Mediterranean. It controlled vast territories stretching across North Africa, Spain, Sardinia, Corsica, and Sicily. Unlike Rome, whose military strength rested on its citizen soldiers, Carthage relied on a vast network of trade, an elite navy, and a formidable army of mercenaries drawn from across the known world. The two civilizations were starkly different. Rome, though expanding, was still an agrarian republic, deeply rooted in its traditions of civic duty and military service. Carthage, by contrast, was a cosmopolitan trading empire, ruled by an oligarchy of wealthy merchants. While Rome fought wars of conquest to secure land and resources for its citizens, Carthage's ambitions were primarily economic, seeking to protect and expand its trade routes. But for all their differences, these two powers shared one crucial similarity: ambition. Neither could tolerate a rival of equal strength, and neither was willing to back down. Their collision was inevitable. What began as a small conflict over Sicily would ignite a series of wars that would determine the fate of the Mediterranean world. The First Punic War, 264 to 241 BCE, erupted when a dispute between local factions in Sicily escalated into a larger struggle between Rome and Carthage. The island, strategically positioned in the center of the Mediterranean, was a prize neither power could afford to lose. Carthage, with its dominant navy, had the upper hand. Rome, having no experience in naval warfare, faced a severe disadvantage. Its military traditions were based on land combat, and its greatest strength lay in the discipline and training of its legions, not in seamanship. But Rome, as always, proved adaptable. The turning point came when a Carthaginian warship ran aground on the Italian coast. Roman engineers meticulously studied its design, reverse engineering their own fleet based on Carthaginian models. Within a few years, Rome, once a purely land-based power, had constructed a fleet capable of challenging Carthage's dominance at sea. However, even with these new ships, the Romans lacked the skill and experience to engage the Carthaginians on equal terms. To overcome this, they developed a groundbreaking innovation, the corvus. This boarding device, essentially a large gangplank with a spike that latched onto enemy ships, allowed Roman soldiers to board Carthaginian vessels and fight in their preferred hand-to-hand style. The corvus turned naval battles into land battles, an area where Rome excelled. With this advantage, Rome achieved a series of stunning victories. At the Battle of Mylae in 260 BCE and the massive naval engagement at Ecnomus in 256 BCE, one of the largest naval battles in history, Rome shattered Carthaginian fleets. The war dragged on for more than 2 decades, draining both sides. Finally, in 241 BCE, after a costly defeat at the Battle of the Aegates Islands, Carthage was forced to sue for peace. Rome emerged victorious, marking its first significant expansion beyond Italy. Sicily became Rome's first overseas province, and soon after, Sardinia and Corsica followed. Carthage, humiliated and weakened, was left to lick its wounds. But the rivalry was far from over. This was merely the first act in a long and bitter struggle. Carthage may have lost the First Punic War, but it was not destroyed. Instead, it turned its attention to Spain, where a brilliant new leader was rising, Hannibal Barca, son of the famed General Hamilcar. From childhood, Hannibal was raised to hate Rome, and when he took command of Carthage's forces in Spain, he vowed to avenge his homeland's defeat. In 218 BCE, he launched one of the most audacious military campaigns in history. Rather than confronting Rome at sea, where it was now superior, Hannibal did the unthinkable. He marched his army overland, crossing the Pyrenees, traversing Gaul, and making the perilous journey over the Alps with a force that included thousands of men, cavalry, and even war elephants. The journey was brutal. Many perished in the freezing conditions, but those who survived emerged into Italy, ready to bring war to Rome's doorstep. Hannibal's campaign in Italy was a masterpiece of strategy. At the Battle of Trebia, he lured the Romans into a trap, ambushing them with a hidden force. At Lake Trasimene, he used the terrain to devastating effect, annihilating another Roman army. But it was at Cannae in 216 BCE that he delivered the most crushing blow. In a brilliant display of tactics, he encircled a vastly superior Roman force and annihilated it. Over 50,000 Roman soldiers were slaughtered in a single day. Rome was on the brink of collapse. Allies wavered, and panic spread through the Republic. But Rome refused to surrender. The Senate, led by Fabius Maximus, adopted a new strategy, one of avoidance and attrition. Fabius, known as the Delayer, refused to engage Hannibal in open battle, instead harassing his supply lines and wearing him down over years of skirmishes. Meanwhile, Rome found a new champion in Scipio Africanus, who led a daring campaign in Spain, cutting off Carthage's resources. In 202 BCE, Hannibal was finally forced to return home, where Scipio crushed him at the Battle of Zama, ending the war. Carthage was left broken, forced into submission, and stripped of its military power. Though Carthage had been humbled, some in Rome believed it was still a threat. Chief among them was Cato the Elder, who ended every speech in the Senate with the same ominous refrain, Carthago delenda est. Carthage must be destroyed. In 149 BCE, Rome found its excuse. When Carthage, despite its weakened state, resisted Numidian aggression, Rome declared war. The Third Punic War was not a contest of equals, it was an extermination. For 3 years, Carthage resisted bravely, But in 146 BCE, Roman forces, led by Scipio Aemilianus, stormed the city. The final siege was horrific, street-by-street combat, fires raging, thousands slaughtered. When the city finally fell, it was utterly destroyed. According to legend, the land was even sown with salt, ensuring nothing would grow again. With Carthage's fall, Rome stood as the unchallenged master of the Western Mediterranean. But with great power came great consequences. The influx of wealth, the expansion of territory, and the strain of constant warfare began to erode the foundations of the Republic. Though Rome had defeated its greatest enemy, new struggles, both external and internal, were just beginning. With the destruction of Carthage in 146 BCE, Rome had become the undisputed master of the Western Mediterranean. The Republic's influence now stretched across Italy, North Africa, Spain, and Greece. The wealth of these conquered territories poured into Rome, transforming it from a city-state into a global power. New provinces were established, each governed by Roman officials who wielded enormous authority over local populations. The conquest of Greece brought not only land and treasure, but also cultural influence. Greek art, philosophy, and literature began to permeate Roman society. Yet with these newfound riches came profound changes. The Republic's expansion had not only reshaped Rome's position in the world, but had also begun to reshape Rome itself. The very system that had allowed Rome to rise, a republic based on citizen soldiers, civic duty, and shared governance, was now being tested as never before. The seeds of internal strife had been sown, and the first signs of Rome's eventual downfall could already be seen. The provinces and the rise of Roman corruption. Visual Roman governors feasting in lavish villas, counting their wealth as peasants toil in the fields outside. Rome's new territories were not governed in the same way as the Republic itself. Unlike Roman citizens, who had a voice in government, the people of the provinces had no such rights. Instead, they were ruled by Roman governors, many of whom saw their positions as opportunities for personal enrichment. These provincial governors, often former consuls or praetors, wielded immense unchecked power. They controlled taxation, military forces, and local administration, leading to widespread corruption. Tax collection in particular became a breeding ground for abuse. Instead of directly collecting taxes, the Roman government auctioned off tax farming rights to wealthy Roman businessmen known as publicani. These tax farmers were ruthless in their pursuit of profit, squeezing the provincials for as much revenue as possible. In some provinces, taxes were so excessive that local populations were driven into destitution, their lands seized, their wealth plundered. For the Roman elite, the provinces were a source of unimaginable wealth. Enormous estates, latifundia, were established, work by thousands of enslaved laborers, taken from Rome's conquests. Meanwhile, in the city of Rome itself, inequality was growing. While the aristocracy grew richer, the common Roman citizen, once the backbone of the Republic, was being pushed aside. The decline of the Roman farmer-soldier. Visual. A weary Roman farmer returns home from war, only to find his land bought out by a wealthy senator, leaving him with nothing. Rome's early strength had been built upon the small citizen farmer who fought in the legions and returned to tend his land. But as Rome's wars became longer and more frequent, these citizen soldiers were forced to serve for years, sometimes decades, far from home. When they finally returned, Many found that their farms had been taken over by wealthy elites who had used war profits to expand their estates. These displaced farmers had little choice but to move to Rome, swelling the ranks of the urban poor. Jobless, landless, and with no means of support, they became dependent on the state for survival. To placate this growing underclass, Rome's politicians began distributing grain doles, free or subsidized grain meant to feed the masses. Over time, this would develop into a system of bread and circuses, where food and entertainment were provided to keep the populace content. As Rome's middle class eroded, the balance of power shifted. The Republic, once a state where power was shared among its citizens, was becoming a society dominated by a small aristocratic elite, while the masses became increasingly reliant on handouts. This economic divide would soon spill over into the political arena, setting the stage for a series of violent struggles that would rock Rome to its core. The Gracchi brothers and the struggle for reform. Visual: Tiberius Gracchus standing before a crowd of Roman citizens passionately arguing for land reform. Amid this growing inequality, two brothers, Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus, emerged as champions of the common people. They sought to address the Republic's economic crisis by redistributing land to dispossessed farmers. Their proposed reforms, however, threatened the power of Rome's elite, who had grown wealthy from the very system the Gracchi sought to dismantle. Tiberius Gracchus, elected tribune of the plebs in 133 BCE, pushed for a law limiting the amount of public land any one individual could own. His proposal was met with fierce resistance from the Senate, but with the support of the people he forced it through. This act enraged Rome's aristocracy, who saw it as an attack on their wealth and privilege. When Tiberius sought re-election, a move seen as an attempt to consolidate power, violence erupted. A group of senators and their followers clubbed him to death in the streets of Rome, marking the first time in centuries that political violence had spilled into the public sphere. A decade later, his younger brother, Gaius Gracchus, took up the cause. More radical than Tiberius, he expanded his reforms, proposing subsidized grain for the poor, public works programs, and even granting citizenship to Rome's Italian allies. His enemies, however, were determined to stop him. In 121 BCE, after a series of riots, the Senate declared him an enemy of the state. Gaius, facing inevitable death, chose to take his own life. His followers were slaughtered in the thousands. The deaths of the Gracchi brothers marked a turning point. Political disputes in Rome were no longer settled by debate. They were now settled by violence. The Republic had taken its first step toward civil war. In the past, Rome's legions had been composed of citizen soldiers who fought for the Republic. But as the class of small farmers dwindled, Rome struggled to recruit soldiers. In response, the general Gaius Marius introduced sweeping military reforms. He opened the legions to the landless poor, offering them pay, equipment, and the promise of land upon retirement. This change had a profound consequence. Soldiers were no longer loyal to the Senate and people of Rome. They were loyal to their generals. A soldier's future now depended not on the Republic, but on his commander's ability to secure rewards. Ambitious generals quickly realized that if they had the loyalty of an army, they had the power to challenge Rome itself. Marius's reforms set a dangerous precedent, one that would be exploited by the likes of Sulla, Pompey, and Julius Caesar. The Republic, once safeguarded by its institutions, was now at the mercy of those who could command legions. The age of military strongmen had begun. Rome's conquests had brought it immense wealth, but also unsustainable problems. Corruption festered in the provinces, the urban poor grew restless, and ambitious generals now saw themselves as the true power in Rome. The institutions that had once held the Republic together were beginning to break under the strain. Unrest was brewing. Soon Rome would face internal conflicts far greater than any external threat. The rise of personal ambition, the corruption of the Senate, and the growing divide between rich and poor were pushing the Republic toward an unavoidable crisis, one that would ultimately lead to the end of Rome as a republic and the rise of an empire. The late 2nd century BCE saw Rome standing at a crossroads. The Republic had conquered much of the known world, but its institutions were faltering under the weight of its own expansion. Political violence had become commonplace, and the social fabric of Rome was fraying. Amid this growing instability, a new force emerged, powerful generals who commanded not only Rome's armies, but also the unwavering loyalty of their soldiers. The Republic, once governed by elected officials and civic duty, was beginning to shift toward rule by military strongmen. At the heart of this transformation was Gaius Marius, a man of humble origins, who would reshape Rome's military and, in doing so, alter the course of its history. Marius, a brilliant and ambitious general, rose to prominence during Rome's wars against the North African kingdom of Numidia. His military genius and relentless drive earned him the consulship in 107 BCE, despite lacking aristocratic lineage, but it was his military reforms that had the most lasting impact. Before Marius, Rome's legions were drawn from land-owning citizens who fought as part of their civic duty. But as the number of small farmers dwindled, so too did the pool of eligible soldiers. To solve this crisis, Marius abolished the property requirement for military service, opening the ranks to the landless poor. This created a professional army, where soldiers enlisted for long campaigns and were paid by their generals rather than the state. While this reform strengthened Rome's military, it also had unintended consequences. Soldiers once loyal to the Republic now depended on their generals for land, wages, and retirement benefits. Their allegiance shifted from Rome itself to the men who led them. For the first time in Roman history, the army was a political weapon, one that could be used to challenge the authority of the Senate. Marius, hailed as the third founder of Rome for his victories, used his popularity to secure an unprecedented 7 consulships, dominating Roman politics for over a decade. But his success set a dangerous precedent. Generals could now bypass traditional republican institutions and rely on their armies to seize power. As Rome's military evolved, another crisis erupted, one that threatened the very foundation of the Republic. For centuries, Rome had relied on its Italian allies, known as the Soci, to supply troops for its wars. These allies fought and died for Rome, yet they remained second-class citizens, denied the rights and privileges of full Roman citizenship. Resentment simmered for generations until, in 91 BCE, it finally boiled over into open rebellion. The Social War, 91 to 88 BCE, pitted Rome against its own Italian allies, who demanded equal status. The conflict was brutal, with entire cities razed and thousands killed on both sides. Rome, realizing that it could not afford to alienate its allies, ultimately granted citizenship to those who had rebelled or who remained loyal. The war was a turning point. The old system, where Rome ruled its allies as subordinates, was gone. Now Rome was not just a city-state. It was the heart of a vast Italian nation. But while the social war resolved one crisis, it paved the way for an even greater conflict, as new power struggles emerged among Rome's most ambitious generals. Even as Rome emerged victorious from the social war, political tensions reached a breaking point. The rivalry between Gaius Marius and Lucius Cornelius Sulla, two of Rome's most powerful generals, would plunge the Republic into its first full-scale civil war. Sulla, a patrician and skilled commander, had risen to prominence during the war against Rome's old enemy, King Mithridates of Pontus in the east. But just as he prepared to embark on his campaign, the Senate, under pressure from Marius and his allies, stripped him of his command and reassigned it to Marius. It was an unprecedented move, one that Sulla refused to accept. For the first time in Roman history, a Roman general marched his own army against the city of Rome. In 88 BCE, Sulla led his legions into the capital, crushing opposition and reasserting his authority. Marius, now an enemy of the state, fled into exile, but he would not remain defeated for long. As soon as Sulla left for the east to fight Mithridates, Marius returned to Rome with his own army, reclaiming power in a bloody purge. His forces massacred Sulla's supporters, filling the streets with corpses. But Marius's triumph was short-lived. He died just days after taking power. Sulla, victorious in the east, returned to Rome in 82 BCE, determined to exact revenge. In a second march on Rome, he crushed his enemies and declared himself dictator, wielding absolute power. He instituted a campaign of terror, proscribing or outlawing his political opponents, leading to mass executions and confiscations of property. Sulla sought to restore order by strengthening the Senate's authority, but in doing so, he showed that military force, rather than republican law, now decided Rome's fate. After ruling as dictator, Sulla shocked Rome by voluntarily stepping down in 79 BCE and retiring. But the damage had been done. The Republic had survived, but it had changed irreversibly. The lesson was clear. Whoever controlled the army controlled Rome. The Republic had entered a new era where power no longer rested in the hands of the Senate, but in the swords of ambitious generals. The Republic had survived the chaos of Marius and Sulla, but the scars remained. Political violence was no longer an anomaly. It was a tool of power. Ambitious men had learned a dangerous lesson. Rome was no longer ruled by laws alone, but by those who could command the loyalty of the legions. In this shifting landscape, Julius Caesar emerged as the Republic's most brilliant, cunning, and ultimately its most transformative figure. Born in 100 BCE, Caesar was of noble lineage, but not immensely wealthy. His early life was shaped by the aftermath of Sulla's dictatorship, during which he was briefly forced into hiding. But Caesar was nothing if not resourceful. He climbed Rome's political ladder with remarkable speed, securing key military and political positions. By 60 BCE, he formed an alliance that would dominate Rome, the First Triumvirate. The Republic's political system was now a battlefield, and success belonged to those who could navigate its treacherous alliances. Caesar joined forces with Pompey Magnus, Rome's greatest general, and Marcus Licinius Crassus, the wealthiest man in Rome. This informal alliance, known as the First Triumvirate, was not an official government body. It was a secret pact between three of Rome's most powerful men, forged for their mutual benefit. Each had something to gain. Pompey, fresh from his victories in the east, wanted land for his veterans. Crassus, the financier of the Republic, sought lucrative military commands. Caesar, ambitious and charismatic, needed military glory and political advancement. To cement their alliance, Caesar's daughter, Julia, married Pompey, tying their families together. With the triumvirate's support, Caesar was elected consul in 59 BCE, securing key reforms that benefited his allies. But the true prize lay ahead. Caesar was granted command of Gaul, an untamed land that would become the proving ground for his legend. From 58 to 50 BCE, Caesar waged a brutal and brilliant campaign in Gaul, modern-day France and Belgium. The Gallic Wars tested not only his military genius, but his political cunning. Facing fierce opposition from the tribes of Gaul, led by the formidable Vercingetorix, Caesar adapted, using superior strategy, engineering, and discipline to crush resistance. One of his most famous victories came at the Siege of Alesia, 52 BCE, where he encircled Vercingetorix's army with a massive double-layered fortification system, trapping them inside while fending off a relief force. The battle was a masterpiece of Roman military engineering and sealed Caesar's dominance over Gaul. With Gaul subdued, Caesar had secured immense wealth, battle-hardened legions, and the undying loyalty of his troops. But back in Rome, his old allies had grown uneasy. Crassus had been killed in 53 BCE while campaigning in Parthia, and Pompey, now aligned with the Senate, saw Caesar as a threat. The First Triumvirate was dead. The Republic, already weakened, stood on the brink of another civil war. The Republic had survived the chaos of Marius and Sulla, but the scars remained. Political violence was no longer an anomaly. It was a tool of power. Ambitious men had learned a dangerous lesson. Rome was no longer ruled by laws alone, but by those who could command the loyalty of the legions. In this shifting landscape, Julius Caesar emerged as the Republic's most brilliant, cunning, and ultimately its most transformative figure. Born in 100 BCE, Caesar was of noble lineage, but not immensely wealthy. His early life was shaped by the aftermath of Sulla's dictatorship, during which he was briefly forced into hiding. But Caesar was nothing if not resourceful. He climbed Rome's political ladder with remarkable speed, securing key military and political positions. By 60 BCE, he formed an alliance that would dominate Rome, the First Triumvirate. The Republic's political system was now a battlefield, and success belonged to those who could navigate its treacherous alliances. Caesar joined forces with Pompey Magnus, Rome's greatest general, and Marcus Licinius Crassus, the wealthiest man in Rome. This informal alliance, known as the First Triumvirate, was not an official government body. It was a secret pact between three of Rome's most powerful men, forged for their mutual benefit. Each had something to gain. Pompey, fresh from his victories in the east, wanted land for his veterans. Crassus, the financier of the Republic, sought lucrative military commands. Caesar, ambitious and charismatic, needed military glory and political advancement. To cement their alliance, Caesar's daughter, Julia, married Pompey, tying their families together. With the triumvirate's support, Caesar was elected consul in 59 BCE, securing key reforms that benefited his allies. But the true prize lay ahead. Caesar was granted command of Gaul, an untamed land that would become the proving ground for his legend. From 58 to 50 BCE, Caesar waged a brutal and brilliant campaign in Gaul, modern-day France and Belgium. The Gallic Wars tested not only his military genius, but his political cunning. Facing fierce opposition from the tribes of Gaul, led by the formidable Vercingetorix, Caesar adapted, using superior strategy, engineering, and discipline to crush resistance. One of his most famous victories came at the Siege of Alesia, 52 BCE, where he encircled Vercingetorix's army with a massive double-layered fortification system, trapping them inside while fending off a relief force. The battle was a masterpiece of Roman military engineering and sealed Caesar's dominance over Gaul. With Gaul subdued, Caesar had secured immense wealth, battle-hardened legions, and the undying loyalty of his troops. But back in Rome, his old allies had grown uneasy. Crassus had been killed in 53 BCE while campaigning in Parthia, and Pompey, now aligned with the Senate, saw Caesar as a threat. The first triumvirate was dead. The Republic, already weakened, stood on the brink of another civil war. By 50 BCE, the Senate, under Pompey's influence, ordered Caesar to disband his legions and return to Rome as a private citizen. Refusing would mean war. Obeying would mean political ruin. Caesar, never one to accept defeat, chose war. In 49 BCE, he led his legions across the Rubicon River, the border of his provincial command. To bring troops into Italy without Senate approval was an act of treason, an open declaration of civil war. As his army marched on Rome, Pompey and the Senate fled to Greece, setting the stage for a decisive conflict. What followed was a swift and masterful campaign. Caesar pursued Pompey across the Mediterranean, winning crucial victories, most notably at Pharsalus, 48 BCE, where his smaller disciplined force shattered Pompey's larger army. Pompey fled to Egypt, where he was assassinated upon arrival, a cruel end for one of Rome's greatest generals. With his enemies vanquished, Caesar marched triumphantly into Rome. The Republic was now his to command, and his ambition had no limits. From 46 to 44 BCE, Caesar ruled Rome with near absolute power. Though he preserved the facade of the Republic, the reality was clear. He was no mere consul or general. He was Rome's first true ruler. He enacted sweeping reforms, debt relief and economic reforms to stabilize Rome. The Julian calendar, a version of which we still use today, expansion of citizenship to more people in the provinces. But not all welcomed his rule. Many saw him as a tyrant, a destroyer of Rome's cherished traditions. In 44 BCE, he declared himself dictator for life. To his supporters, he was the savior of Rome. To his enemies, he was a king in all but name. On March 15th, 44 BCE, the Ides of March, a conspiracy was born. A group of senators, including his close friend Brutus, plotted his assassination. In the Senate chambers, Caesar was stabbed 23 times, his final words, "Et tu, Brute," a haunting whisper of betrayal. As his body lay lifeless on the marble floor, Rome stood at yet another crossroads. The Republic, already battered, had lost its most powerful leader. But Caesar's death did not restore the Republic. Instead, it would ignite another power struggle, one that would end not in the revival of the Republic, but in the birth of an empire. The assassination of Julius Caesar on March 15th, 44 BCE, was meant to be a turning point. The conspirators, led by Brutus and Cassius, saw themselves as liberators. They believed they were restoring the Roman Republic, saving it from the grip of tyranny. But they had made one fatal miscalculation. They had killed the man, but not the movement he represented. Instead of restoring order, Caesar's death sent Rome spiraling into chaos. The people, many of whom had adored him, were outraged. The legions, fiercely loyal to their fallen commander, waited for someone to lead them. The Senate, now devoid of its most dominant figure, was paralyzed. In the void left behind, new power struggles erupted, setting the stage for the final violent collapse of the Republic. One man understood the power of spectacle better than any other: Mark Antony, a devoted ally of Caesar. In the days following the assassination, Antony seized the moment, delivering a funeral oration that would change Rome forever. Holding up Caesar's bloodied robe, he addressed the mourning crowd. He reminded them of Caesar's victories, his generosity, his refusal to be crowned king. Then he revealed Caesar's will, which granted money and land to the Roman people. The reaction was explosive. The funeral turned into a riot. Soon after, the city descended into anarchy. The conspirators, realizing they had lost the people's favor, fled Rome. Antony, now the most powerful man in the city, began maneuvering for control. But he was not the only one with a claim to Caesar's legacy. Few had anticipated the emergence of Octavian, a mere teenager at the time of Caesar's assassination. But the late dictator had named him in his will as his adopted son and heir, granting him not just his fortune, but his name. From now on, he would be known as Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus. At first, few took him seriously. Antony dismissed him as an inexperienced boy, while the Senate saw him as a potential pawn. But Octavian was far more cunning and strategic than anyone had expected. He quickly secured the loyalty of Caesar's veteran legions, using the promise of vengeance against the assassins as his rallying cry. With power coalescing around him, a new alliance was formed. In 43 BCE, Octavian, Antony, and Marcus Lepidus, another of Caesar's generals, created the Second Triumvirate, a legal, three-man dictatorship that held absolute control over Rome. Unlike the First Triumvirate, this was no mere political alliance. It was a military regime, forged in blood and dedicated to crushing Caesar's killers. One of the triumvirate's first acts was to initiate the proscriptions, a brutal purge of their political enemies. Anyone declared an enemy of the state was executed and their property confiscated. Thousands perished, including Cicero, Rome's greatest orator, who had vehemently opposed Antony. His severed hands and head were nailed to the rostra in the Forum as a grim warning to others. With their enemies in Rome eliminated, the triumvirate turned their attention to the final goal, avenging Caesar's death by hunting down Brutus and Cassius. In 42 BCE, the two sides met at the Battle of Philippi in Macedonia. On one side stood the armies of Brutus and Cassius, the last defenders of the Republic. On the other, the forces of Antony and Octavian, determined to avenge Caesar and claim Rome for themselves. The battle was brutal and chaotic. Cassius, misled by false reports of defeat, took his own life. Brutus, after a desperate fight, followed suit, falling on his sword. With their deaths, the last hope of the Republic perished. The victors, Antony and Octavian, now had total control over Rome. But peace was not to last. With no more common enemies, the alliance between Antony and Octavian quickly deteriorated. After Philippi, Rome was effectively divided. Antony took the east, while Octavian controlled the west. In Egypt, Antony fell under the influence of Cleopatra, the legendary queen who had once been Caesar's lover. Their relationship was more than romantic. It was a political alliance, one that Octavian would use to his advantage. In Rome, Octavian launched a propaganda war, portraying Antony as a traitor who had abandoned his Roman heritage for an Egyptian queen. Tensions escalated into open conflict. In 31 BCE, the two sides clashed at the Battle of Actium, a decisive naval battle that saw Octavian's fleet crush Antony and Cleopatra's forces. Defeated, the lovers fled to Egypt, where they took their own lives. With Antony dead, there was now only one man left standing, Octavian. The Republic was dead, and a new age was about to begin. With Antony and Cleopatra gone, Octavian would go on to reshape Rome forever, not as its ruler in name, but as its emperor in all but title. The Republic had died with Caesar, but from its ashes something even greater would rise, the Roman Empire. But beneath this veneer of peace and prosperity, a fundamental weakness remained, the question of succession. Augustus had no surviving sons, and his desperate attempts to secure an heir became an obsession that would define the later years of his reign. He adopted and groomed several potential successors, including his grandsons Gaius and Lucius Caesar, only to suffer heartbreak as they died unexpectedly. His friend and general Agrippa, once a strong candidate, also passed away. In the end, the only viable option left was Tiberius, his stepson from his marriage to Livia. Tiberius was an experienced general, but lacked the charm and charisma of Augustus. More importantly, he had never been the first choice. When Augustus died in 14 CE, at the age of 75, the empire mourned him as a god. The Senate officially deified him, marking the first time in Roman history that a ruler was declared divine. Statues and temples were erected in his honor, and his legacy was secured as Rome's first and greatest emperor. Yet with his death, a new challenge arose, the transition of power. Unlike the Republic, where leadership was shared among elected officials, the empire now depended on a single ruler. Would future emperors be as competent as Augustus, or had he created a system vulnerable to corruption, excess, and instability? The world Augustus had built would endure for centuries, but his reign had set a precedent that would define the empire's fate. The age of emperors had begun, and the future of Rome would rest in the hands of men who, for better or worse, would shape history in their own image. With Augustus gone, Rome stood at a crossroads. For the first time, the empire faced a transfer of power, not through the Senate or the battlefield, but through succession. The man who inherited Augustus's empire was Tiberius, his stepson, a seasoned general, but an unwilling ruler. Unlike Augustus, who had carefully crafted his image as Rome's benevolent leader, Tiberius was cold, distant, and deeply mistrustful of those around him. His reign would mark the beginning of a new reality, one in which the fate of Rome was determined not by the Senate, but by the whims and character of its emperors. Tiberius had spent years in Augustus's shadow, proving himself on the battlefield, yet never fully earning the public's love. His greatest military campaigns had expanded Rome's influence in Germania and along the Danube, securing the empire's borders. But unlike Augustus, Tiberius lacked the charisma and vision to inspire the masses. When he ascended to the throne in 14 CE, he did so without the jubilant celebrations that had greeted his predecessor. The Senate, now fully subservient to imperial rule, confirmed him as emperor without resistance, but many whispered that he had only been chosen out of necessity, not desire. Tiberius, perhaps sensing this lack of enthusiasm, withdrew from public life. He refused grand ceremonies, avoided the people, and governed from a distance. His leadership was defined by paranoia. He saw conspiracies everywhere, executed suspected traitors, and relied heavily on his ruthless advisor, Sejanus, the commander of the Praetorian Guard. Sejanus became the true power behind the throne, orchestrating purges and eliminating rivals under the guise of protecting the emperor. The political climate grew tense, with senators and noble families living in constant fear of accusations that could lead to their ruin. Then, in 26 CE, Tiberius made an unprecedented decision. He left Rome entirely. He retreated to the island of Capri, isolating himself in a lavish palace while Sejanus ruled in his name. This was a turning point. For the first time, Rome had an emperor who chose not to rule from the capital, leaving the empire in the hands of an unelected bureaucrat. Sejanus tightened his grip on power, elevating his allies and crushing his enemies. At one point, he even positioned himself as a potential successor. But his ambitions grew too bold. In 31 CE, rumors reached Tiberius of Sejanus's betrayal. In a dramatic reversal, the emperor ordered his execution. The once feared commander of the Praetorian Guard was dragged through the streets and killed, his body left to rot as a warning to others. Though Sejanus was gone, the damage had been done. Tiberius, now more paranoid than ever, ruled through terror. Treason trials became commonplace and executions increased. The emperor trusted no one, and Rome suffered under his increasingly erratic leadership. When he finally died in 37 CE, the city did not mourn him. Instead, the people cheered in the streets, eager to embrace a new ruler. That ruler was Caligula, the great nephew of Tiberius and the son of the beloved general Germanicus. At first, Rome rejoiced. Young, charismatic, and full of promise, Caligula was seen as the savior of the empire, a return to the golden days of Augustus. He abolished the treason trials, pardoned prisoners, and lavished the people with games and celebrations. But this hopeful beginning would not last. Within months, Caligula fell severely ill. When he recovered, he was no longer the same man. What followed was one of the most infamous reigns in Roman history. Stories of Caligula's madness are legendary. His extravagant spending, his brutal purges, his demand to be worshipped as a living god. He humiliated senators, executed those who displeased him, and drained the imperial treasury on lavish spectacles. He waged a bizarre campaign in northern Gaul, supposedly ordering his soldiers to collect seashells as spoils of war. Whether these accounts are exaggerated or not, one thing is certain: Caligula ruled through fear, and his erratic behavior could not be tolerated forever. In 41 CE, after just 4 years on the throne, the Praetorian Guard had had enough. They assassinated Caligula in a brutal coup, stabbing him repeatedly before turning on his family. For the first time, an emperor had been overthrown by his own protectors. In the chaos that followed, the Senate debated restoring the Republic. But the Praetorian Guard had other plans. Searching the palace, they found Caligula's uncle Claudius, a man thought to be weak and politically irrelevant. They proclaimed him emperor, and with that, the dream of restoring the Republic died once more. The reign of Augustus had ushered in a new era, but it also created a dangerous precedent. Rome was no longer governed by law, tradition, or the Senate. It was ruled by the ambitions, fears, and weaknesses of emperors. And as history would soon show, not all of them would be worthy of the throne. The ascension of Claudius in 41 CE was an accident of history. Shy, awkward, and physically frail, he had been overlooked for most of his life, dismissed as unfit for politics, yet fate had intervened. In the wake of Caligula's assassination, the Praetorian Guard needed a new ruler, someone who could stabilize the empire while remaining dependent on their support. Hiding behind a curtain in the imperial palace, Claudius was discovered by the guards and, in a twist of irony, was declared emperor against his will. The Senate hesitated, unsure whether to accept this unexpected ruler, but the Praetorian Guard had spoken. With their backing, Claudius took the throne, proving that military power, not senatorial tradition, was now the true source of authority in Rome. Despite his inauspicious start, Claudius proved to be a capable and intelligent ruler. Unlike his predecessors, who had been raised in the public eye, he had spent years studying history, administration, and governance in relative obscurity. Now, with the empire in his hands, he sought to strengthen and expand Rome's influence. One of his greatest achievements was the invasion of Britannia in 43 CE, a campaign that brought the island under Roman control for the first time. Although Julius Caesar had attempted to conquer Britannia nearly a century earlier, it was Claudius who succeeded in integrating it into the empire. He celebrated his triumph with a grand procession in Rome, cementing his status as a true leader, not merely a puppet of the Praetorian Guard. Beyond military expansion, Claudius focused on internal reforms. He improved Rome's infrastructure, building new roads, aqueducts, and harbors. He restructured the imperial bureaucracy, relying on freedmen, former slaves, to serve as his administrators. This decision, while efficient, earned him enemies among the traditional senatorial class, who resented the growing power of men they considered beneath them. But Claudius, ever pragmatic, cared little for aristocratic pride. His rule was about results, and by most measures it was a success. Yet despite his accomplishments, Claudius's reign was plagued by intrigue and betrayal. He had married Messalina, a woman notorious for her ambitions and excesses. While Claudius busied himself with governance, she indulged in wild affairs, amassing power and manipulating court politics. Eventually she went too far, plotting a coup against her own husband. When Claudius learned of her betrayal, he had her executed without hesitation, a brutal reminder that even those closest to the emperor could not be trusted. Following Messalina's death, Claudius remarried, this time to Agrippina the Younger, the niece of the late emperor. Intelligent, calculating, and ruthlessly ambitious, Agrippina had her sights set on securing power for her son Nero from a previous marriage. She convinced Claudius to adopt Nero, making him the heir over Claudius's own son Britannicus. Then, in 54 CE, Claudius mysteriously fell ill and died. Many suspected poisoning at Agrippina's hands. Whether true or not, her plan had worked. Nero, barely 17 years old, now ruled the empire. At first, Nero's reign seemed promising. Guided by wise advisors such as the philosopher Seneca and the general Burrus, he presented himself as a just and cultured leader. He supported the arts, reduced excessive taxation, and even participated in public performances, playing music and reciting poetry to the people. Yet as time went on, Nero's indulgences grew darker. He became obsessed with his own grandeur, losing interest in governance while surrounding himself with flatterers and sycophants. The turning point came in 59 CE, when he ordered the murder of his own mother Agrippina. Their relationship had soured as Agrippina sought to control her son's rule. Desperate to rid himself of her influence, Nero first attempted to stage a fatal accident by engineering a boat to collapse while she was at sea. When she survived the plot, he resorted to the direct approach, sending soldiers to her villa to execute her. When they arrived, Agrippina reportedly told them to stab her in the womb, the place that had given birth to such a monstrous son. Her death marked Nero's full descent into tyranny. From that moment on, his rule became increasingly erratic. The Great Fire of Rome in 64 CE devastated much of the city, and while historical accounts differ, many accuse Nero of either neglecting the crisis or deliberately setting the fire to clear space for his grand architectural projects. According to legend, he played the lyre as the city burned, a tale likely exaggerated, but one that cemented his reputation as a ruler detached from his people's suffering. To deflect blame, Nero scapegoated the growing Christian community, ordering brutal persecutions and executions. Discontent grew, and by 68 CE, revolts erupted across the empire. The Senate, sensing an opportunity, declared Nero an enemy of Rome. Abandoned by his guards, he fled the city, eventually taking his own life with the infamous words, "What an artist dies in me." With Nero's death, the Julio-Claudian dynasty, founded by Augustus, came to a chaotic and ignoble end. But the empire could not rest. The question of who would rule next would plunge Rome into one of its darkest and most dangerous periods, a year of bloodshed, betrayal, and civil war known as the Year of the Four Emperors. With the death of Nero in 68 CE, the Roman Empire stood on the precipice of chaos. For the first time, there was no clear successor to the throne, and the empire was left without an emperor. What followed was one of the most turbulent years in Roman history, a time of war, betrayal, and shifting allegiances that would come to be known as the Year of the Four Emperors. The first to seize power was Galba, an aging and stern senator who had long governed Spain. With the support of the Senate and the military commanders in the west, he marched on Rome, where the Praetorian Guard, having turned against Nero, declared him emperor. But Galba was no savior. He immediately alienated the very soldiers who had placed him on the throne by refusing to pay them the bonuses they had expected. He ruled with brutal austerity, executing perceived threats without trial and showing no tolerance for opposition. His inability to command loyalty would soon cost him dearly. As resentment grew, a rival emerged, Otho, an ambitious nobleman and former ally of Nero, who had expected to be named Galba's heir. When Galba instead selected another successor, Otho acted quickly, bribing the disgruntled Praetorian Guard to support him. On January 15th, 69 CE, the guards turned on Galba, murdering him in the streets of Rome. His severed head was paraded through the city, and Otho was hailed as emperor. But his rule was doomed before it had even begun. In the provinces, the legions did not recognize Otho's authority. In Germania, the powerful general Vitellius was declared emperor by his troops, and he began marching on Rome. Otho, knowing his position was weak, tried to negotiate, but Vitellius refused any compromise. In April of 69 CE, their armies met at the Battle of Bedriacum, where Otho's forces suffered a crushing defeat. Rather than drag Rome into further bloodshed, Otho took his own life, hoping to spare the empire from civil war. His reign had lasted just 3 months. Vitellius now claimed the throne, but his rule was marked by excess and incompetence. A man of indulgence rather than discipline, he emptied the treasury on lavish feasts and extravagant games while ignoring the growing discontent in the eastern provinces. In Judea, the general Vespasian, who had been tasked with suppressing the Jewish revolt, saw an opportunity. His troops, along with legions in Egypt and Syria, declared him emperor. Unlike the self-indulgent Vitellius, Vespasian was a practical and battle-hardened leader, respected by his soldiers and admired for his administrative skill. With his legions behind him, Vespasian launched a campaign to seize the throne. His forces, led by the brilliant general Antonius Primus, marched into Italy and defeated Vitellius's army in a second battle at Bedriacum. As the victorious legions closed in on Rome, Vitellius, desperate to hold on to power, attempted to flee, but the city had turned against him. In a final act of brutality, Vespasian's soldiers dragged Vitellius from his hiding place, paraded him through the streets, and executed him in full view of the Roman people. By December of 69 CE, the civil war had come to an end, and Vespasian entered Rome as the undisputed ruler. Unlike his predecessors, who had relied on bloodlines or personal ambition, Vespasian's power rested on his military support and his reputation as a stabilizing force. He wasted no time in restoring order, restructuring the empire's finances, and rebuilding a government that had nearly collapsed under the weight of Nero's excesses and the chaos of the civil war. Vespasian's reign would mark the beginning of the Flavian dynasty, a new era of Roman rule built on military strength, administrative reform, and a vision of long-term stability. But the scars of the Year of the Four Emperors remained, a reminder that Rome, though powerful, was not invincible. The empire had survived its greatest internal crisis yet, but even greater challenges lay ahead. With the empire in shambles after the Year of the Four Emperors, Rome needed stability. That stability came in the form of Vespasian, a man who had risen from humble origins to become one of Rome's most capable leaders. Unlike his predecessors, who had been born into nobility, Vespasian was the son of an equestrian, Rome's middle class. He had built his reputation through military service, proving his worth as a commander in campaigns across Britain and Judea. Now, as emperor, he faced the daunting task of restoring order to an empire that had nearly torn itself apart. One of Vespasian's first priorities was financial recovery. The extravagant spending of Nero and the civil war had drained Rome's treasury. In response, Vespasian introduced new taxes and restructured the economy. He famously taxed public toilets, prompting criticism, to which he reportedly replied, "Money does not stink." His fiscal discipline stabilized Rome's finances, ensuring that the empire could continue its expansion and administration. Vespasian also embarked on massive building projects, reinforcing his legacy as a practical and forward-thinking ruler. He commissioned the construction of the Flavian Amphitheatre, later known as the Colosseum, one of the most iconic structures in history. Built on the site of Nero's lavish Golden House, the Colosseum symbolized a shift away from Nero's self-indulgence and back toward public service. The massive arena would host gladiatorial contests, mock sea battles, and public spectacles, reinforcing the emperor's connection with the people. Beyond Rome itself, Vespasian focused on securing the empire's borders and maintaining stability in the provinces. The Jewish revolt, which had begun under Nero, was still ongoing, and it fell to his son, Titus, to complete the conquest. In the 70 CE, after a brutal siege, Roman forces sacked Jerusalem, destroying the Second Temple, an event that would have lasting consequences for Jewish history. Titus returned to Rome in triumph, bringing back vast treasures from the temple to fund the Flavian building projects. Despite his achievements, Vespasian ruled with pragmatism rather than tyranny. He reformed the Senate, balancing power between the aristocracy and the equestrian class. He also distanced himself from the paranoia that had plagued previous emperors, choosing instead to rule with a level of humor and tolerance. It was said that on his deathbed in 79 CE, he joked, "Oh dear, I think I'm becoming a god," mocking the tradition of deifying emperors. His death marked the beginning of a smooth transition as his son, Titus, took the throne. Unlike past successions which had been marred by intrigue and violence, this one was peaceful, a testament to the stability Vespasian had restored. Titus was beloved by the Roman people, remembered for his generosity and his handling of crises, including the devastating eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 CE, which buried Pompeii and Herculaneum under ash and stone. Yet Titus's reign was brief. He ruled for only 2 years before dying under mysterious circumstances, possibly poisoned by his younger brother, Domitian, who now seized power. Domitian, unlike his father and brother, would prove to be a very different kind of ruler, one who would reign with fear, suspicion, and absolute authority. The Flavian dynasty, which had begun with promises of stability, was about to take a darker turn. With the sudden death of Titus in 81 CE, the throne passed to his younger brother Domitian. Unlike his father Vespasian or his brother Titus, Domitian was not known for his military achievements or his administrative skills. He had spent much of his life in the shadow of his family, watching as they restored order to an empire on the brink of collapse. Now, as emperor, he would rule with an iron grip, transforming Rome into a state where loyalty was demanded, opposition was crushed, and power was centralized in a way not seen since the days of Augustus. Domitian saw himself as Rome's supreme ruler, preferring the title Dominus et Deus, Lord and God, over the more traditional princeps. He was determined to reinforce imperial authority, curbing the power of the Senate and ruling as an absolute monarch. While earlier emperors had maintained a facade of cooperation with the Senate, Domitian openly treated them as subordinates. He filled key positions with loyalists and removed anyone he suspected of disloyalty, creating an atmosphere of fear within Rome's political elite. Despite his authoritarian rule, Domitian was an effective administrator. He strengthened Rome's economy, standardizing taxation and increasing military pay to ensure the loyalty of the legions. He also launched ambitious building projects, completing the Arch of Titus in honor of his late brother, and constructing grand structures such as the Stadium of Domitian, which would later evolve into modern-day Piazza Navona. These projects reinforced his image as a leader committed to Rome's grandeur, even as his methods became increasingly oppressive. On the empire's frontiers, Domitian adopted a defensive military strategy. Unlike his father, who had expanded Rome's borders, Domitian focused on consolidating and protecting existing territories. He reinforced the Limes Germanicus, a network of fortifications along the Rhine and Danube rivers, creating a more permanent frontier against Germanic tribes. However, his wars in Dacia, modern-day Romania, proved costly. After suffering defeats, he was forced to buy peace with Decebalus, the Dacian king, a move that angered many in the military, who saw it as a humiliation for Rome. Domitian's rule grew increasingly paranoid and brutal. He launched a series of treason trials, targeting senators, wealthy elites, and even members of his own family. Anyone suspected of conspiracy was executed or exiled, leading to a reign of terror among Rome's aristocracy. His relationship with the Senate deteriorated completely, as he saw them as useless relics of a past era. This hostility would ultimately seal his fate. In 96 CE, after 15 years of increasingly oppressive rule, Domitian's enemies struck. A conspiracy, likely involving members of his own household and the Senate, led to his assassination in his palace. His body was unceremoniously dumped, and his memory was condemned. His statues were destroyed. His name was erased from public inscriptions, and his rule was officially damned by history. With Domitian's death, the Flavian dynasty came to an end. But Rome did not descend into chaos. Instead, power passed to an elderly and respected senator, Nerva. For the first time in decades, Rome had a ruler who was chosen not by bloodline or military force, but by consensus. His rule would mark the beginning of a new era, one of wisdom, stability, and the careful selection of emperors. Rome was about to enter its golden age, a time of peace and prosperity, under the rule of the so-called five good emperors. With the fall of the Flavian dynasty, Rome stood at a crossroads. The chaotic successions of the past had shown the dangers of unchecked ambition, and the empire desperately needed stability. That stability came in the form of Nerva, a respected senator chosen by the conspirators who had overthrown Domitian. Unlike his predecessors, Nerva had no military background and no direct claim to the throne. His legitimacy rested on the support of the Senate and the promise of a return to cooperative governance. His reign would be short, but it would set a precedent that would guide Rome through one of its greatest periods of prosperity, the era of the five good emperors. Nerva's primary task was to ease the tensions left behind by Domitian's reign of terror. Upon taking power, he immediately repealed many of Domitian's harsh policies and released political prisoners. He restored confiscated property to senators and sought to rebuild trust between the emperor and the aristocracy. However, while the Senate welcomed these changes, the military remained a significant threat. Many soldiers had benefited from Domitian's rule and resented Nerva's lack of experience. His greatest challenge came when the Praetorian Guard, the elite force tasked with protecting the emperor, revolted. They demanded vengeance for the murder of Domitian, storming the palace and taking Nerva hostage. Humiliated, Nerva had no choice but to concede to their demands, allowing the execution of Domitian's killers. The event exposed a harsh truth. Without military support, an emperor could not survive. Realizing this, Nerva took decisive action. In 97 CE, he adopted Trajan, a highly respected general, as his heir, an unprecedented move that ensured a smooth transition of power. When Nerva died the following year, Trajan became emperor without conflict, ushering in an age of stability, expansion, and competent leadership. Trajan was everything Rome needed. A seasoned military commander, he was deeply respected by the legions, securing their loyalty in a way Nerva never could. At the same time, he was politically astute, maintaining a close relationship with the Senate while still holding absolute authority. His reign marked the height of Rome's territorial expansion, as he launched successful campaigns that pushed the empire's borders further than ever before. His most famous conquest was Dacia, modern Romania, a wealthy kingdom rich in gold. After two brutal wars, Dacia was annexed in 106 CE, and its vast resources flowed into Rome, funding the grandest building projects the empire had ever seen. Among Trajan's greatest achievements was the construction of Trajan's Forum, a sprawling complex of markets, administrative buildings, and monuments designed to glorify Rome's power. At its heart stood Trajan's Column, a towering monument adorned with intricate carvings depicting his victories in Dacia. Even today, it remains one of the best preserved relics of ancient Rome, offering a visual record of the empire's military campaigns. Beyond conquest, Trajan was also deeply invested in public welfare. He expanded the grain dole, ensuring that Rome's poor had access to food, and launched ambitious infrastructure projects, building roads, bridges, and aqueducts that connected the vast empire. Unlike many emperors who ruled through fear, Trajan was genuinely loved by his people, earning the rare title Optimus Princeps, the best ruler. Yet, even at the height of its power, Rome was not invincible. In 113 CE, Trajan embarked on an ambitious campaign in the east, seeking to conquer Parthia, Rome's long-standing rival. Initially, his armies were victorious, capturing the Parthian capital of Ctesiphon and pushing deep into Mesopotamia. But the conquest proved unsustainable. Revolts broke out across the region, stretching Rome's resources thin. In 117 CE, while on campaign, Trajan fell seriously ill and died before he could return to Rome. His death marked the end of an era of aggressive expansion. Before he passed, Trajan is said to have named his successor, Hadrian, a man with a very different vision for the empire. Where Trajan had sought conquest, Hadrian would focus on consolidation and defense, ensuring that Rome's golden age would endure. The empire had reached its territorial peak, but now it had to sustain itself against the mounting challenges of governing such an enormous realm. The era of expansion was over. Now came the task of preservation. With Trajan's death in 117 CE, the Roman Empire stood at its greatest territorial extent. The conquests of Dacia, Arabia, Armenia, and Mesopotamia had pushed its borders further than ever before. Yet with these vast new lands came new challenges, rebellions, logistical strains, and the ever-present threat of overextension. Into this delicate situation stepped Hadrian, a ruler whose philosophy differed sharply from his predecessors. Where Trajan had been a conqueror, Hadrian would be a preserver, recognizing that Rome's power could not be sustained by endless expansion alone. Hadrian's first major act was to abandon many of Trajan's eastern conquests, notably Mesopotamia and Armenia. Though this decision angered many within Rome, particularly the military elite, Hadrian understood that these territories were indefensible against the powerful Parthian Empire. By consolidating control over Rome's existing provinces instead of stretching its resources thin, Hadrian ensured the empire's long-term stability. His vision was one of secure, well-administered borders rather than reckless conquest. One of Hadrian's most enduring legacies was the construction of defensive fortifications, the most famous being Hadrian's Wall in Britain. Stretching 73 miles, 117 kilometers, across the northern frontier, this massive stone barrier was designed to mark the limits of Roman control and defend against incursions from the unconquered Caledonian tribes of Scotland. Though it was not an impenetrable fortress, Hadrian's Wall served as a powerful symbol of Rome's commitment to protecting its empire rather than endlessly expanding it. Similar fortifications were built along the Rhine and Danube, reinforcing Rome's northern borders. Hadrian was also an intellectual and a traveler, unlike many emperors who ruled from the luxury of Rome. He spent much of his reign personally inspecting the provinces, traveling from Britain to Egypt, from Spain to Syria. Everywhere he went, he left his mark, commissioning temples, aqueducts, and cities that strengthened Roman identity across the empire. He took a particular interest in Greece, seeing it as the cultural heart of the empire. His most famous architectural project was the Pantheon, rebuilt in Rome as a grand temple to all gods, featuring the massive dome that still stands today as one of the greatest engineering achievements of antiquity. However, Hadrian's rule was not without conflict. His relationship with the Senate was strained, as he often bypassed them in favor of ruling directly through imperial edicts. But his greatest crisis came in Judea, where simmering tensions erupted into a full-scale revolt, the Bar Kokhba Rebellion, 132 to 136 CE. The Jews, angered by Roman repression and the emperor's attempt to build a pagan city over Jerusalem, waged a desperate war for independence. Led by Simon Bar Kokhba, the Jewish forces inflicted heavy casualties on Rome, forcing Hadrian to commit massive military resources to crush the rebellion. When it was finally suppressed, Judea was devastated. Hundreds of thousands perished. Jewish religious practices were outlawed, and Jerusalem was renamed Aelia Capitolina, with a Roman temple erected over its ruins. Despite these challenges, Hadrian's rule marked a period of internal strength and artistic flourishing. His efforts to consolidate Rome's holdings, improve administration, and reinforce its defenses laid the groundwork for continued stability. However, as his health declined in his later years, he struggled to find a worthy successor. After much deliberation, he chose Antoninus Pius, a senator known for his wisdom and diplomacy, under the condition that Antoninus would later adopt Marcus Aurelius and Lucius Verus, ensuring a smooth transition of power. Hadrian died in 138 CE, leaving behind a secure and well-organized empire. Though his defensive policies were controversial in his time, history would judge him as one of Rome's most capable and visionary rulers. Under Antoninus Pius, Rome would enjoy one of its most peaceful and prosperous periods, a golden age of stability before the turbulent reign of Marcus Aurelius and the challenges that lay ahead. With the passing of Hadrian in 138 CE, the Roman Empire entered a period of remarkable peace and prosperity under his chosen successor Antoninus Pius. Unlike his predecessors, Antoninus was not a warrior or a traveler. He never led a military campaign, never expanded Rome's borders, and never left Italy during his 23-year reign. And yet his rule is often considered one of the most stable and successful in Rome's history. Antoninus was known for his diplomatic skill and administrative efficiency. He focused on internal improvements, strengthening Rome's legal system, reforming provincial governance, and ensuring the smooth collection of taxes. He earned the title Pius, meaning dutiful or devoted because of his deep respect for the Senate and his commitment to honoring Hadrian's wishes. He maintained strong relations with Rome's aristocracy, avoiding the political purges and executions that had plagued previous rulers. Despite his peaceful reign, Antoninus was not blind to the threats beyond Rome's borders. Rather than engaging in costly wars, he reinforced Rome's defensive fortifications, including extending Hadrian's Wall in Britain and strengthening outposts along the Danube and Rhine rivers. His ability to maintain security without direct military intervention was a testament to Rome's immense power. Barbarian tribes knew that any attack on Roman territory would bring swift and devastating retaliation. Economically, Rome flourished under Antoninus. Trade flowed across the empire, from the spices of India to the grain of Egypt, enriching Rome's cities and expanding infrastructure. He invested heavily in public works, repairing roads, aqueducts, and temples across the provinces. His administration promoted education, philosophy, and the arts, reinforcing the cultural vibrancy of the empire. Yet for all his successes, Antoninus's reign also exposed an underlying issue. The empire's future stability depended on the abilities of its rulers. Rome's prosperity rested on a delicate balance of military strength, economic vitality, and competent governance. While Antoninus provided a golden age, he also avoided many of the difficult challenges that would soon test the empire's resilience. In 161 CE, Antoninus Pius died peacefully at the age of 74, passing the throne to his adopted sons, Marcus Aurelius and Lucius Verus. For the first time, Rome would be ruled by co-emperors, an arrangement that reflected the growing complexity of governing such a vast empire. While Lucius Verus was more concerned with luxury and indulgence, Marcus Aurelius, a philosopher-ruler, would be forced to confront some of the most daunting crises in Rome's history. The era of peace was over, and the empire was about to be tested as never before. Almost immediately, trouble erupted on multiple fronts. In the east, the powerful Parthian Empire launched an invasion of Rome's territories in Armenia and Syria, forcing Lucius Verus to lead a massive counter-offensive. Rome's legions eventually triumphed, but the returning soldiers brought back something far more deadly than any enemy army: the Antonine Plague. Likely a strain of smallpox or measles, this devastating disease swept across the empire, killing millions and severely weakening Rome's economy and military. At the same time, the Germanic tribes along the Danube saw an opportunity. With Rome weakened, the Marcomanni, Quadi, and other barbarian groups launched a massive invasion, breaking through the empire's defenses and threatening Italy itself. For Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher-emperor, war was not a pursuit of glory, but a grim necessity. He spent much of his reign leading Rome's armies in brutal campaigns along the Danube, personally enduring the hardships of battle and earning the respect of his soldiers. Despite the mounting crises, Marcus Aurelius remained committed to his Stoic philosophy, writing his famous work, Meditations, a reflection on duty, virtue, and the burdens of leadership. His ability to govern wisely in the face of immense adversity made him one of Rome's most revered rulers, embodying the ideal of the philosopher king. Yet even the greatest emperors could not escape the inevitable challenges of succession. As Marcus Aurelius neared the end of his life, he made a fateful decision, one that would unravel much of the stability built by his predecessors. Instead of adopting a capable successor as Hadrian and Antoninus had done, He placed the empire in the hands of his biological son, Commodus. It was a choice that would soon plunge Rome into corruption, cruelty, and chaos, setting the stage for the empire's slow decline. With the death of Marcus Aurelius in 180 CE, Rome's golden age came to a crashing halt. His son, Commodus, was nothing like his father. Where Marcus Aurelius had been a philosopher king, ruling with wisdom and restraint, Commodus was reckless, egotistical, and obsessed with personal glory. His reign would mark the beginning of Rome's slow but inevitable decline. Commodus's rule was defined by extravagance and instability. He abandoned his father's military campaigns against the Germanic tribes, opting instead for a hasty peace that left Rome's northern borders vulnerable. He had no interest in governance, leaving the administration of the empire to corrupt advisors while he indulged in lavish entertainments. His obsession with gladiatorial combat became infamous. Unlike past emperors who merely sponsored games, Commodus saw himself as a warrior, even stepping into the arena to fight as a gladiator, a scandalous act for a Roman ruler. While he basked in self-indulgence, the empire spiraled into mismanagement and economic trouble. Commodus drained the treasury to fund extravagant spectacles, devalued Rome's currency, and brutally executed senators and officials he saw as threats. Paranoia consumed him. He believed in conspiracies everywhere and purged anyone he suspected of disloyalty, from high-ranking generals to members of his own family. His egomania reached new heights when he declared himself the reincarnation of Hercules, renaming Rome after himself as Colonia Commodiana, and demanding that statues and inscriptions across the empire be altered to reflect his divine status. This level of megalomania alienated the Senate, the military, and even his closest allies. Eventually, a conspiracy formed against him, and in 192 CE, Commodus was assassinated, poisoned, then strangled in his bath by an assassin sent by his own inner circle. With Commodus dead, Rome was thrown into chaos. The following year, known as the Year of the Five Emperors, saw multiple claimants rise and fall in rapid succession as the empire plunged into civil war. Pertinax, a respected senator, was chosen as emperor, but was murdered by the Praetorian Guard after only 3 months when he refused to pay them off. The Guard then auctioned the empire to the highest bidder, selling the throne to a wealthy senator, Didius Julianus, who could offer them the largest bribe. This brazen corruption outraged the legion stationed in the provinces, and soon several rival generals declared themselves emperor. From the chaos emerged Septimius Severus, a skilled military leader who marched on Rome, overthrew Julianus, and brutally crushed his opponents. His rise to power in 193 CE marked the beginning of the Severan dynasty, a period that saw the empire shift toward a more militarized and autocratic rule. Unlike the philosopher emperors of the past, Severus ruled with an iron fist, relying heavily on the army to maintain control. Severus recognized that Rome's stability depended on military strength, and he made sweeping changes to the army. He increased soldiers' pay, allowed them to marry while in service, and gave them greater privileges, securing their loyalty. But in doing so, he also weakened the Senate's influence, making the army the true power behind the throne. This shift toward military dictatorship would have long-term consequences, setting a precedent where emperors were made and unmade by the legions rather than the Senate. Despite his harsh rule, Severus was a capable leader. He strengthened Rome's defenses, launched successful campaigns in Britain and the Middle East, and maintained relative stability. But upon his death in 211 CE, he left the empire in the hands of his two sons, Caracalla and Geta, whose bitter rivalry led to yet another bloody conflict. Caracalla, after murdering his brother, ruled as a brutal and paranoid tyrant, remembered for massacres, economic mismanagement, and the infamous Caracalla Baths. Though he did enact the Antonine Constitution, granting Roman citizenship to nearly all free inhabitants of the empire, his reign was dominated by cruelty and military excess. Caracalla's assassination in 217 CE plunged Rome into further instability. The Severan dynasty would stagger on for another decade, but the empire had become dangerously dependent on military power. Emperors were no longer chosen for their wisdom or administrative skill, but by the loyalty of their legions. This shift made Rome increasingly vulnerable to internal power struggles, setting the stage for the crisis of the 3rd century, a period of civil war, economic collapse, and external invasions that would bring the empire to the brink of total ruin. With the rise of Constantine the Great, the Roman Empire entered a new era, one that would reshape its identity and lay the foundations for the medieval world. After years of civil war following Diocletian's abdication, Constantine emerged as the sole ruler of Rome in 324 CE, bringing an end to the instability that had plagued the empire for nearly a century. But his most defining act would not be military conquest. It would be his embrace of Christianity, transforming the religious and cultural fabric of the empire forever. Constantine's relationship with Christianity was complex. According to tradition, on the eve of the Battle of the Milvian Bridge in 312 CE, he received a vision of a cross in the sky, accompanied by the words, "In this sign, conquer." He ordered his soldiers to paint the Chi-Rho, a Christian symbol, on their shields, and won a decisive victory against his rival Maxentius. Whether this vision truly occurred or was a later fabrication, it marked the beginning of Constantine's alignment with the Christian faith. In 313 CE, he issued the Edict of Milan, officially legalizing Christianity and granting religious tolerance throughout the empire. For the first time, Christians could practice their faith openly without fear of persecution. Constantine went further, actively promoting and funding the church, building grand basilicas such as Old Saint, Peter's in Rome, and the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. He granted privileges to Christian clergy and incorporated Christian ideology into imperial governance. Yet Constantine's rule was not solely defined by religion. He recognized that Rome itself was no longer the ideal capital of the empire. The Eternal City had become politically unstable and strategically vulnerable, too distant from the empire's critical frontiers. In 330 CE, he established a new imperial capital on the site of Byzantium, renaming it Constantinople. This new city, located at the crossroads of Europe and Asia, was heavily fortified, filled with grand structures, and designed to be a new Rome, a symbol of stability, power, and Christian dominance. The shift to Constantinople marked a turning point. Though Rome remained symbolically important, the empire's center of gravity had permanently shifted eastward. Over time, the Western Roman Empire would weaken, while the eastern half, later known as the Byzantine Empire, would continue to thrive for centuries. Despite his religious patronage, Constantine was still a Roman ruler, engaging in brutal political maneuvers. He executed his own son, Crispus, and his wife, Fausta, under mysterious circumstances, showing that imperial politics remained as ruthless as ever. Even as he embraced Christianity, he continued to uphold elements of Roman tradition, maintaining the title of Pontifex Maximus, the chief priest of Rome's pagan religion, and only accepting baptism on his deathbed in 337 CE. After Constantine's death, the empire again fell into division. His sons fought among themselves, weakening the stability he had worked so hard to restore. By the mid-4th century, Rome faced new and dangerous threats from beyond its borders, most notably the Huns and the Germanic tribes. The most pivotal moment came in 378 CE, when the Roman army suffered a catastrophic defeat at the Battle of Adrianople. The Gothic leader Fritigern led a rebellion against Emperor Valens, crushing the Roman legions and even killing the emperor in battle. This defeat shattered the myth of Roman invincibility and exposed the empire's inability to control its borders. From this point onward, the Germanic tribes would play an increasingly dominant role in Roman affairs, not as enemies to be repelled, but as forces that would shape the empire's fate from within. In 395 CE, Emperor Theodosius I became the last ruler to govern both the eastern and western halves of the empire. Upon his death, he permanently divided the empire between his two sons, Arcadius in the east and Honorius in the west. This division would prove disastrous for the Western Roman Empire, which faced mounting pressures from barbarian invasions, internal corruption, and economic decline. The cracks in Rome's foundation had become fractures. The empire's vast borders were no longer defensible. Its legions relied increasingly on foreign mercenaries, and its leaders were often weak, more focused on palace intrigues than governance. The rise of powerful Germanic warlords, some of whom served as Roman generals, foreshadowed what was to come. Rome was no longer the master of its own destiny. The Western Roman Empire, once the undisputed ruler of the Mediterranean world, was on the brink of its final collapse. By the late 4th and early 5th centuries, the Western Roman Empire stood on the edge of oblivion. Decades of internal decay, economic collapse, and external invasions had hollowed out what was once the mightiest empire in the world. Its eastern counterpart, ruled from Constantinople, remained strong, but the West was unraveling. The final chapter of Rome was about to be written, not by emperors or senators, but by the barbarians who had once been held at bay by the legions. The most cataclysmic event came in 410 CE, when the city of Rome itself, the Eternal City, untouched by foreign enemies for over 800 years, was sacked by the Visigoths, led by their king Alaric. Rome, once thought invincible, was plundered and humiliated, though Alaric, a Christian, spared much of its sacred sites. The psychological impact was immense. Rome was no longer the center of an empire. It was simply another city, vulnerable to the forces of history. Meanwhile, the empire's infrastructure continued to crumble. By the mid-5th century, the Western Roman government had lost control of large swaths of its territory. Britain was abandoned entirely in 410 CE, left to fend for itself against Saxon and Pictish invaders. Gaul, Spain, and North Africa fell to Germanic tribes like the Vandals, Burgundians, and Franks. The once mighty Roman army, depleted and demoralized, could no longer mount an effective defense. In 455 CE, Rome suffered another devastating sack, this time by the Vandals, who stripped the city of its treasures and took captives. The empire was now only a shadow of its former self, its leaders mere puppets controlled by barbarian warlords. The final blow came in 476 CE, when the Germanic general Odoacer deposed the last Roman emperor, the boy ruler Romulus Augustulus. Rather than taking the imperial title for himself, Odoacer simply sent the imperial regalia to Constantinople, marking the symbolic end of the Western Roman Empire. Though the West had fallen, Rome's legacy was far from over. The Eastern Roman Empire, now known as the Byzantine Empire, would continue for another 1,000 years, preserving much of Rome's administrative and cultural traditions. Meanwhile, the Catholic Church, centered in Rome, became the dominant spiritual and political force in the West, ensuring that the idea of Rome lived on in a different form. Rome's influence endured not just through its institutions, but through its language, its laws, its architecture, and its ideals. The concept of the Roman Empire inspired countless rulers, from Charlemagne to the Holy Roman Emperors, and even into the modern age, where its echoes can be seen in legal systems, government structures, and military traditions across the world. Though the Western Roman Empire fell in 476 CE, the story of Rome never truly ended. Its rise, its triumphs, its struggles, and its collapse serve as a timeless lesson, a reminder of the heights that civilization can reach and the forces that can bring even the greatest empire to ruin. Rome was not built in a day, nor did it fall in one. Its story is one of ambition and conquest, resilience and transformation, spanning over 1,000 years from its humble beginnings as a small settlement along the Tiber River to its reign as the most formidable empire in history. From the legendary tale of Romulus and Remus to the rise of the Republic, from the glories of Julius Caesar and Augustus to the splendor of the Pax Romana, and from the crises of 2008, the 3rd century, to the final collapse of the Western Roman Empire in 476 CE, we have seen Rome rise, evolve, struggle, and ultimately succumb to forces both external and internal. Rome's greatest strength was its ability to adapt. A city-state that overthrew its own monarchy and pioneered a republic where power was balanced between the Senate, the magistrates, and the people, became a vast empire stretching from Britain to the Middle East. It survived civil wars, economic turmoil, and political corruption, constantly reshaping itself to meet the challenges of its time. Even when emperors like Nero and Commodus led Rome astray, others like Trajan, Hadrian, and Marcus Aurelius restored its dignity. Even in its decline, Rome endured, fighting to maintain its supremacy for centuries before its inevitable fall. But though the Western Roman Empire crumbled, Rome's legacy never truly faded. The Eastern Roman Empire, or Byzantine Empire, carried on for another 1,000 years, preserving much of Rome's laws, governance, and traditions until its fall in 1453 CE. Meanwhile, the Catholic Church, rising from the very city where emperors once ruled, carried forward the Roman spirit, influencing medieval Europe and shaping the course of Western civilization. Even the very idea of Rome as a center of power, culture, and knowledge was never forgotten. Charlemagne sought to revive it. The Holy Roman Empire bore its name. The Renaissance rekindled its art, literature, and philosophy. Today, the footprints of Rome are everywhere. Its legal system laid the foundation for modern law codes, with principles such as innocent until proven guilty still upheld in courts around the world. Its engineering feats, roads, aqueducts, bridges, and grand amphitheaters continue to stand as marvels of human ingenuity. Its language, Latin, lives on in Romance languages like Italian, Spanish, French, and Portuguese, as well as in the technical vocabulary of science, medicine, and law. Even modern governments owe a debt to Rome, drawing inspiration from its republican ideals, its senate, and its system of checks and balances. But perhaps Rome's greatest lesson is a cautionary one. No empire, no matter how powerful, is immune to internal corruption, economic decline, or external pressures. Rome's fall was not sudden. It was the product of centuries of mismanagement, division, and complacency. It stands as a reminder that even the mightiest civilizations must adapt, innovate, and remain vigilant to survive. And yet Rome never truly died. Walk through its ruins, and you will feel the echoes of the past, the grandeur of the Colosseum, the solemnity of the Roman Forum, the majesty of the Pantheon. Rome still stands, not just as a city, but as an idea, a symbol of human ambition, endurance, and influence. It is a civilization that shaped the world and whose legacy will continue to inspire generations to come. Rome was, and in many ways still is, the eternal city. If you've made it to the end of this journey, thank you for joining us as we explored the rise and fall of Rome. From its legendary founding to its enduring legacy, we've walked through the triumphs and struggles of one of history's greatest civilizations. Rome's story is more than just the past. It is a reminder of the forces that shape nations, the resilience of human ambition, and the lasting impact of ideas that continue to influence our world today. If you enjoyed this experience and want to continue exploring the stories of history in a way that is both enriching and relaxing, consider liking this video and subscribing to Historem. Your support helps us bring more captivating historical journeys to life. Let us know in the comments what era or civilization you'd like to explore next. Thank you for being a part of this adventure. Until next time, let history guide you.